There was a time when I used to say something. I'm not really sure how I got into that attitude and that frame of mind. It was about 10 years ago. But I sort of had a motto that went, the older the minister, the better. I felt, I guess it was because we had a couple of young fellows that we had ordained who had sort of let us down. It was, as is often the case, a reaction, not a carefully thought out position. And last night I was talking with Mr. Lineker, and he was reminding me of something that some people say to this day, and I think maybe it was also influential. And the reason why I said what I did was something to the effect that they were lamenting these 25-year-old ministers straight out of college trying to tell us how to live our lives. And actually, I was 27 when I went out of college and began to tell people how to live their lives, but I guess there's not a lot in that. A lot of the fellows were, back in those days, 25 or even younger. But the problem with reaction as a means to the truth is that we sometimes forget to consult the Bible along the way. Let me tell you a little short story out of the Bible that might help us to get this in focus. Once upon a time, there was a woman who had no child. And this was a terrible vexation to this lady, partly because her husband's other wife was really giving her fits. She had babies. This lady had not had any babies. Well, she went up to the temple annually with her, as she always did with her husband, and her husband loved her dearly. I mean, she was his favorite wife. She just hadn't had any children. He did everything he could to try to make it up to her. And as she lamented her childless state, he would say to her, "Look, am I not better to you than 7 sons?" And he was, I'm sure, a very good man and very kind to his wife. But as she was in the temple one day praying with great fervency, and her face was obviously distorted with it, and her lips moved as she prayed, and the high priest who was sitting nearby looked at her and thought she was drunk. Rather an abrupt conclusion, I suppose. I mean, a man might at least have wandered by and see if he could smell her breath or something. But he went over and rebuked her for being in the temple and drunk. And she says, "Oh, no, my Lord. I'm not drunk." And then she explained her childless condition and how she was just beseeching God to grant her a child. And Eli, somewhat chastened, the priest, said, "Well, God grant your petition and go in peace." Well, God did grant her petition, and she had a son. His name was Samuel. And she had promised in this prayer that she made to God that if God would give her a son, that she would give that son to God all of his days. And the Bible tells us, and the account is found back in 1 Samuel, that she kept the child with her until the child was weaned, and then she took the child up to the temple and gave him to the Lord. Now, I don't know at what age this boy was weaned. I think they weaned him a little later than mothers often do today. But in any case, he was still a child when he actually went in to serve in the temple with Eli. I expect he was like a lot of pages or, the apprentice-type servant. His job was to carry and put Eli's food on the table, or to fetch and carry for Eli, or to get whatever it was that Eli wanted. Because Eli was an old man, and I imagine it was a help to have these young legs pitter-pattering around, taking care of this, go fetch that, go do that, do this and the other thing. And of course, in the process, Eli and the other priests who were there would have educated the boy because they were the prime educators of the day. Well, there came a night, and the account begins in 1 Samuel 3 and verse 1. It says, "The child Samuel ministered to the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was precious," or rare in those days. "There was no open vision." Now, we are still dealing with a boy, a lad. "It came to pass at the time when Eli was laid down in his place, and his eyes began to wax dim that he could not see. And ere the lamp of God went out in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was, and when Samuel was laid down to sleep, that the Lord called Samuel, and he answered, 'Here am I.'" He's lying in his bed, and there is a voice in the room. It doesn't thunder, it doesn't rattle the woodwork. It is just a voice that would have been about right if it had been Eli, who was down the hallway and off to one side, who had called him. "Samuel." He said, "Here am I." And he sat up, looked around, didn't see Eli, got out of his bed, walked down the hallway into Eli's room, and said, "Here am I, my Lord." And Eli said, "I didn't call your son. Go on back to bed." So Samuel went, and as he was told, and went back to bed. It happened twice. Now it tells us in verse 7, Samuel did not know the Lord, neither was the word of the Lord yet revealed to him. And the Lord called Samuel the third time, and he arose and went to Eli, and he says, Here am I, because you did call me. Eli, by this time, realizes what has happened. It was not what he expected. Here is an old man, an old priest, who, as far as his own service is concerned, there is no serious judgment against him except for the fact that he did not restrain his two sons, who were a blight on the priesthood. But he was the one that God would have expected, that we would have expected God to speak to, not this child who was his servant going to and fro in the temple. But Eli perceived that the Lord had called the child. So Eli said to Samuel, Go and lie down, and it shall be, if he calls you, that you shall say, Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. So Samuel went and lay down in his place, and I don't think sleep was on his mind. And the Lord came and stood and called as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel answered, Speak, for your servant hears. Then comes a message, and I want you to think about this message. If God were to want to speak to you, would you hear it from a child? Could you accept it from a child? Because what we have here is a child. We might want to argue as to whether he was 13 or 14 or a teenager. One thing is for sure, he was still just a boy. Here's what God told him. Behold, I will do a thing in Israel at which both the ears of everyone that hears it shall tingle. In that day I will perform against Eli all the things I have spoken concerning his house, and when I begin I will make a full end. For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows. Now this is fascinating because he says, I have told him what I'm going to do, and it's for the iniquity that he knows. The message is not new. There's really nothing new in it. He even knows the reason. God doesn't have to tell him the reason. But it seems that it is important that someone else know. Because Eli is going to die. Someone had to have the message. Because of the iniquity which he knows. Because his sons made themselves vile, and he made no effort to restrain them. Therefore have I sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be purged with sacrifice nor offering forever. That's a sobering thought. Samuel lay until the morning. I am sure he did not sleep. And he opened the doors of the house of the Lord, and Samuel was afraid to show Eli the vision. Then Eli called Samuel, and he said, Samuel, my son? And he answered, Here am I. And he said, What is the thing that the Lord has said to you? I pray you hide it not from me. God do so to you and more also, if you hide anything from me of all the things that he said to you. And Samuel told him every whit, and hid nothing to him. And he said, It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and did let none of his words fall to the ground. But he was a boy. Now, I sometimes ponder this and things like it when I think of our rather curious attitude toward messengers of God. And I have known for a long time that God has a habit of sending a message by the person from whom you are least likely to receive it. Think about that one for a while. Now, if God wanted to speak to you and he had something he wanted to tell you, and there's something that God really wants you to know, who do you think he would choose to bring you the message if he wanted to choose someone whom you would be least likely to hear? Someone who you would not be respecting his person, his stature, his age, his wisdom. You would simply be forced to accept what was said as the Word of God and not just somebody else's opinion. It would be humbling. I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it, but there are people that would hurt if I had to take certain kinds of correction and the Word came from God through them. But even that would have its value in conveying that thought to me. There is another incident a little later. In 1 Samuel, the 16th chapter, God has in the interim called a man named Saul, who was a young man, head and shoulders above everybody in Israel, and a strong man, and made him king. And Saul, as we know, spectacularly failed. And God said to Samuel, after Saul was rejected by God, He says, "How long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go, and I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons." Now Samuel said, "Well, I can't go down there. If Saul hears it, he'll kill me." And the Lord gave him an excuse. He had a heifer to take down there, call him to sacrifice, and we'll do it that way. Verse 4, Samuel did that which the Lord spoke, and he came to Bethlehem. And the elders of the town trembled at his coming and said, "Do you come peaceably?" Now, I don't think Samuel's very old yet. And when he comes into town, the elders of the town tremble because he's come into the place. He said, "I come peaceably. I'm come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he sanctified Jesse and his sons, and he called them to the sacrifice. And it came to pass when they were come, he looked upon Eliab and said, "Oh my goodness, look at this young man. Look at this man. Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't look on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. For man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks upon the heart." And I sometimes look at myself and I wonder, how many times am I going to have to be told that? How many times am I going to have to come face to face again and again with the truth that God does not look on the heart? That He does not look for the tall, the handsome, the wise. He does not look for the sage, the person who is so obviously intelligent, the person with all the wisdom and who's been around for many years and has the experience. Eli had all of that. Saul had the stature. Saul had the looks. And so it goes. So Jesse called his next son and made him to pass before the Lord. And God says, "That's not the one either." And Jesse made Shammah to pass by, and he says, "Nope, not this one." Again, Jesse made 7 of his sons to pass by, and Samuel finally said, "The Lord hasn't chosen these." And he says, "Is this all of your children?" Because he was certain that God wanted him to take one child. This is where I'm supposed to be, and I haven't found the person yet. He said, "Well, there remains one, the youngest, and behold, he keeps the sheep." Now, folks, there is only one reason why David wasn't brought forward. It is because he was not only the youngest, he was perceived by Jesse to be too young. It's as simple as that. He was perceived to be too young. And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and fetch him, because we're not going to sit down until he's here." So he sent and brought him in, and he was ruddy and with all of a beautiful countenance and goodly to look to. And the Lord said in Samuel's ear, "Arise, anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. Now, does this say anything to you? Is there a message somehow that comes rolling in, or that drifts into your consciousness behind all of the excitement and the interest of all this stuff? That God rejected all of the older sons, went not only to the youngest of the sons, but one that was perceived by his own father to be too young to even be considered in this situation. It wasn't because he wasn't a good-looking kid. Wasn't because he wasn't an intelligent kid. Wasn't because he wasn't active. It wasn't because he lacked in faith. It wasn't because of any of these things. His father thought he was too young. And he is the one that God chose. Why? What's the reason? Well, I can give you at least a couple. One of them is the humility factor. And that is that we all need to learn that God doesn't necessarily choose us because we're taller, older, taller or older, or better looking, or whatever it may be, than other people are. Not many wise, not many noble, not many of the great people of the world are called. That God chooses the base to confound the wise, and He chooses the young, I think, to confound the old in many cases. But here it is, it leaps off the page at us. But now there is also a story that follows on the heels of this that I think may help us to understand another aspect of why God responds to people and to circumstances in the way that He does. You're familiar with the story. You could probably tell it to me. Israel is at war with the Philistines. And they have lined up on one side of a valley, and the Philistines are lined up on the other side of the valley. And the soldiers are exercising what is probably one of the safest things they could do. They're yelling back and forth at one another. And the Philistines are saying, send us a champion down here to fight our champion. Now, their champion would have been as tall as, reaching pretty close to the top of this room, I suppose. His spear was like a weaver's beam. He had this huge shield that he took. He was a giant of a man. And all the Israelites looked out at him and said, not me. No way. And they were all scared to death of this man. Now, meanwhile, Jesse decides to send David back up to the front with bread for his sons, some loaves for his sons. So he loads him up and he puts it on. Of course, David is pretty excited about that. He gets to go up and see where all the action is. And so up he goes with carrying the bread. This is the youngest son's, a boy's job. Now, he wasn't just he's not a 7 or 8 year old by this time. He is well beyond that. But he is still probably too young to be considered for what he is going to be considered for. He comes up to his brothers to bring the bread to them, and his oldest brother says to him, I know what you're doing, you little wart. What are you doing up here? You've just come up because you want to see the battle. He said, give me that bread. Well, everybody's going back and forth with all this noise, and David says, what's the big deal? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he would challenge the Lord's anointed? I don't get it. And people began to report this stuff back and forth, what David was saying. And, of course, his brothers were embarrassed as they could possibly be about the fact that David was doing this. There's some interesting things about this. Younger men often have a courage that is sometimes lacking in older men. You may call it foolhardiness. You may call it what you will, but the courage is still there nevertheless. Sometimes they will fight when older men will not. Secondly, there is a naivete in the youth. They haven't learned all the things that they can't do. They haven't learned all the things that God can't do. When God says, he just believes, God is up there. This is the armies of the living God. How can this uncircumcised Philistine flaunt the armies of the living God this way? We can't have this. I'll go fight him if none of the rest of you will. It's astonishing. But do you realize that what you are seeing, apart from the fact that here is a man of enormous faith, a man anointed of God, a man led by God and gifted of God, who was a very young man, he also had that foolish faith of the young, that it never occurred to him that the Philistine could beat him. Never crossed his mind. He believed in God, and he believed in what he could do. He said, they said, well, who do you think you are? He said, look. He said, I'm a shepherd. And when a lion came or a bear came, I was able to fight them and defeat them and to kill them and to protect the sheep. What makes you think I can't win in this particular battle as well? So the story is well known to us all. David fought, and David won, and became a proverb in Israel all through this. Now, if you contrast this with his older brother's cynicism, it's interesting. Because his older brother, who was not willing to fight Goliath, said to him as soon as he shows up, I know why you're here, you naughty boy. You have come up here to see the battle. Cynicism imputes a selfish motive to other people for nearly everything they want to do. Oh, you're just doing that for yourself. Oh, you just want to do that. Oh, you've got your agenda. Oh, you've got your goals. The cynical person always is tossing that off. And a lot of times the young have not learned to be cynical yet, and therefore are much more useful toward God. The qualities of youth are courage, naivete, simplicity, faith, zeal, energy. And David's motto, as I've said in an earlier sermon, was just do it. With him, it was not a question of talking about it, analyzing it, trying to figure all the angles. It was just do it. But I can hear myself saying, but youth makes mistakes. Boy, do they ever. And the line of mistakes that would exist in David's life from this time forward is not inconsiderable. Youth makes mistakes, so maybe we ought to play it safe. Think about that statement for a moment. Youth makes mistakes, therefore we will. What is that but a reaction? It's not something carefully thought out. It's not something that I've applied the Bible to. It is a reaction. We get burned once, and then forevermore we won't have anything to do with it. As they say, was it twice burned, thrice shy? We just flat back off and refuse to go that direction. And yet, the Bible is here, and the lessons are here, and again, youth is thrust to the forefront. Visualize in your mind, if you would, for a moment, Jeremiah. What do you think that Jeremiah looked like? What's your vision? You think old guy, kind of a big gray beard coming down here, maybe receding hair up the front, a little gray in the back, and a pair of eyes that would burn holes in a brick wall? Is this kind of the Jeremiah that's in your mind? I certainly think of him as a very intense person. What do you suppose Jeremiah looked like? In the first chapter, we don't get a whole lot of clue about what he looked like, but we get something that blows what a lot of people would have assumed Jeremiah looked like into a cocked hat. Jeremiah 1 and verse 3. It came to pass in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, the 11th year of Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, to the carrying away of Jerusalem captive in the 5th month. Then the word of the Lord came to me, that's to Jeremiah, saying, Before I formed you in the belly, I knew you. And before you came forth out of the womb, I sanctified you. And I ordained you a prophet to the nations. How old, folks, do you have to be a prophet? Now, I knew you in the womb. I set you apart in the womb. And I ordained you a prophet to the nations. Now, the ordained is past tense. I don't know that you're going to say he ordained him in the womb, but the word ordained, in the sense that it's used here, really means I destined, I set your goal, or what you were going to be, from the womb as a prophet to the nations. Then said I, Lord God, I cannot speak. I am a child. I don't know how old he was, but he wasn't 30. He had not yet come to 30 years of age. 17, 18, 22, take your pick. He was a very young man and had been designated by God to become and to be a prophet from the womb. What age did he start into the service of God? We don't know. Could it possibly have been like Samuel, that he was a boy carrying and fetching in the temple long before he ever came of age to where he began to prophesy? God's response, the Lord said to him, Don't you tell me you're a child. Behold, you will go, and you will do all that I send you to, and whatever I command you, you will speak. Don't be afraid of their faces, for I am with you to deliver you, saith the Lord. Then the Lord put forth his hand and touched his mouth, and the Lord said to me, Behold, I have put my words in your mouth. Whose words? My words. In Jeremiah's mouth, who was yet not of age. See, I have this day set you over the nations and over the kingdoms, to root out, to pull down, to destroy, to throw down, to build, and to plant. Why do you suppose God would have chosen a child to do this? Oh, I think there's a reason for it, and maybe we'll come to it in a few moments. What do you visualize when you think about Ezekiel? What do you suppose Ezekiel looked like? Once again, balding, gray-haired, gray-beard, old man with wrinkles all over his face. Is that what Ezekiel would be like? Look at the first chapter of Ezekiel. Once again, our ideas may have to have some adjustment. Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month. 30th year of what? Well, he says, I was among the captives by the river Kibar. The heavens were open, and I saw visions of God in his 30th year. In the 5th day of the month, which was the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity. So it wasn't the 30th year of the captivity, it was only the 5th year of that. The fact is, the commentaries point out there isn't anything back there except Ezekiel's own birth. Ezekiel was probably 30 years old by the river Kibar when he saw the heavens open, saw the wheel within the wheel, and saw all the visions that take place. He wasn't some old gray-bearded prophet. He was a young man in the prime of life, muscular, well-built, strong, without a doubt. Probably had a beard, of course, but it wasn't anywhere near gray yet. He was a young, active, virile man in the prime of life when God called him. Now, both of these prophets got old. So if you envision them as old men, you're not entirely wrong. They were old to begin with, but they started young. You can't imagine how hard it is to start in the service of God when you are older. I remember when I applied to Ambassador College, we sent the application off and waited for it to come back and waited, and we wanted to start packing. If we were going to go, we had jobs and plans for being in college in the autumn in Abilene, and I had decisions to make. So I sent them a telegram, and I said, I need to know. And they sent a telegram back that says, don't quit your job yet. Few older men are accepted. I was 24. Few older men accepted. They were looking for 18-year-olds in Ambassador College back in those days. Now, it's not impossible to start into the service of God when you were older. It's just harder. I was 44 when I went down to the University of Texas in 1978 to begin work on a doctorate degree, hopefully to come back and be the president of Ambassador College maybe someday. 44. It was a lot harder than it was when I was in my 20s, and I didn't think that it would be. I thought, I'll go down there. It's just study. I can do that. But I found that it was harder, a lot harder. The energy level that had been there when I was in my 20s was simply not there. The ability to go on into the night, the ability to lose sleep and not suffer for it the next day, it was not there at age 44 like it had been at age 24. You know, when I come to my age now, I'm 59, and I no longer have the desire for it. The idea of, at one stage, of going off to the university and seeking a PhD and doing all the work would have filled me with excitement and anticipation. Now, if I had to do that, it would fill me mostly with dread. Not because I might not be able to do it, not because I could not carry through the program, but because it's just not something at this stage of life that I really want to do. Now, I want you to think about a simple truth. Start in the ministry when you are 60, and you will never have 35 years of experience in the ministry. Just not going to get there. Now, you might, under normal circumstances, have lived to be 95, but probably not in the ministry. But that's beside the point. Most of us simply aren't going to make it to age 95. Standing before you today, I have 35 years of experience in the ministry. And by the time I get to where I'm 70 years old, I'll have 46 years of experience in the ministry. You start at age 60, and you can never get there. Now, I don't want to discourage any of you older men, but isn't what I'm telling you the truth? I mean, can you deny it? Well, of course not. It is a fact of life. I remember when I started on the PhD program down at the University of Texas in 1978, I thought, I was debating on whether to do that or maybe study law at that particular point in time. I thought studying law would be interesting. But I began to reflect on some of the really successful lawyers and jurists and judges and what have you. And these were people who started young and then had many, many years to gain experience, background, knowledge, understanding. They took on the patina of old age. They knew where the bodies were buried. They knew where the rocks were. They knew all the cliches you want about the knowledge and experience you gain. It takes a long time to gather in all of that experience and to be able to use it effectively as some of these, 55, 60, and 62-year-old attorneys who can be really formidable in the courtroom. They weren't that formidable 30. It is simply a fact of life. But for a little more Bible, if you please. Turn back to Luke, the 3rd chapter. Luke, the 3rd chapter. And I'll begin reading in verse, if I can find the right spot, 21. Now, when all the people were baptized, it came to pass that Jesus, being baptized and praying, the heaven was opened, and the Holy Spirit descended in bodily shape like a dove upon him. And a voice came from heaven which said, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age. 30 years old. May I ask, how many men are there in this room that are 30 right now? You're 30. Who else? Would you gentlemen stand up where you are? All 30-year-old men. Exactly. No more, no less. This is the age that Jesus was when he began his ministry. Please, you go ahead and sit down. Not my age, not Mr. Deacon's, Dr. Deacon's age, not Charles Gross's age. Their age. 30 years old. Now, I sort of consider these guys that stood up here wet behind the ears. But the truth is, 30-year-old men have reached a certain level of maturity. They've managed to complete their education. They've gotten a little experience behind them. They have energy. They have a strength. They haven't begun to kind of rot away like some of us do. We get a little bit older. They have a lot to say for them. Jesus was not 60 when he did his work. You tend to, as you read through the New Testament, and you note the deference that his disciples pay to it, you tend to think of him, well, he must be 55 or 60 or something like that, except for the fact that we all know better. Of course, he was how many jillions of years old, but the point is that in the flesh, he was 30. What's important is the men who were with him were probably 30 also. I'll bet they were 30 to a man. Think about it. They had to walk up and down the length and breadth of Palestine again and again and again. They had to endure a great deal of hardship. They had an enormous amount to learn in 3.5 years. They did not need to have families already that they were responsible for, that they had to go leave wife and squalling children at home to take care of. They didn't need all this. They needed stamina, they needed strength, and they needed the enthusiasm and zeal that comes along with youth. Jesus went into the temple and saw the money changers and sheep and goats and oxen and people making money right, left, and sideways. Turned around, took some small cords and made himself a whip and walked up to the nearest goat and whacked him right on the rump. Goat would have been very effective for that. Sheep might not have been quite as effective. The goat probably went right through 2 or 3 tables, and he kicked a couple of them over with his foot and started throwing people out of the place. At age 30, you do things like that. At age 60, you kind of wonder whether it's worth the trouble. It says, his disciples remembered the scripture that says, "The zeal of your house has eaten me up." Young men have more zeal than older men have got. They just do. And it's a truth. I don't know, I don't want to, again, I'm not here to beat up on older men, but that's just the way it is. It was Peter, by the way, who was probably about 33 years old when he cut off the high priest's servant's ear. Just got his sword out and hacked that thing off of there. James and John were called Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. They're the ones that whenever this city in Samaria said, "We're not going to have you people in the town," they turned to Jesus and says, "Well, want us to call down fire from heaven? Let's burn them up, nuke them." And Jesus had to calm them down and say, nope, that's not the spirit that we want here. Remember, these were young men. They were walking up and down the hills with the Messiah. They were aging very fast. Well, one day, not so very long ago, I woke up and looked around at our ministry. And I looked the length of it, and I looked the breadth of it, and behold, it was very old. Our ministry is old, and it naturally, as the way things have to be, it's getting older all the time. I'm aware of that because I am from time to time. Now, we have all the benefits of age: wisdom, experience, patience. We're not nearly so apt to come down on somebody as a younger man might be. But we also have the liabilities. Body does not work quite the same way it used to work. We don't heal as quickly as we did years ago. We strain a muscle, it may be 6 months before the pain goes completely away, rather than just being a few weeks. We often are suffering from failing health. The problems of getting older began to creep up on us. You have prostate problems, and sometimes beginning stages of cancer start coming along, or we start having, irregular heartbeats and are taking medication for that. The thing gets patched together. In fact, in some cases, my age would be a really old man back in the first century. And it's only because, the doctors are able to patch us up and keep us running that we sometimes are able to go on as long as we possibly can. We suffer from failing health. We also suffer from lower energy levels. We just don't have the drive that we might have had as a younger man. And another thing that kind of comes along, it's a kind of a spiritual hardening of the arteries. Now, I honor our ministers for their service, for their sacrifice, and really for all of for their conversion and the things that they do. And if it weren't for them, I don't know where we would be today. And we've had some very old ministers in this church who are totally converted, absolutely dedicated, and would give their lives for Christ and for His work, and I honor them for it. But I would not be honest if I did not own up to the creeping cynicism that has overcome some of our ministers from time to time. It's just one of those things that does come along. And I woke up to realize that there is nothing really wrong with our ministry that youth would not cure. And I don't believe that any of us are going to be getting any younger. And therefore, in order to lower the age of the ministry, what do we have left to do? Since we're not going to be able to find a fountain of youth and turn the clock back, what do we have left to do? We are going to have to find younger ministers. I woke up to that. I must confess, I should have known it all along. It was stupid of me not to be aware of it. It was silly of me to fall into that trap that I fell into of saying, well, the older the minister, the better. Because the truth is, this ministry desperately needs youth to balance the wisdom and the experience and the hardening of the arteries, and to give us the zeal and the drive and the energy and the enthusiasm and the idealism that sometimes begins to ooze away from us who are a little bit older. There is a fear in some quarters of the Church of God International of the academy. And it's difficult for me to get my mind around, but I do accept that the fear is very real. I think some people are afraid that we're going to repeat old mistakes, all the way going back to having 25-year-old ministers that we send out in the field to run people's lives. Now, of course, we have ministers who are 60 and 70 and 80 in the Church of God International who are not trying, I trust, to run your life. College and the radio Church of God, which it was in those days, and we had your name and address and would come by to see you. Well, welcome. And we would go in and we would sit down and we would talk. And I would answer their questions out of the Bible. When I was a young minister, I knew my Bible. I had a lot of faith. I really believed that God would heal the sick. And so I could anoint people and I could pray for people and I could weep with people. And when their children were hurting and were hurting in the hospital, I would go to them. Say, well, they make mistakes. Young ministers are no good. The truth is that there are times I find that I wish I could reach down inside of myself and find some of the stuff that I had back then. I wish I could find some of the idealism that I had back then. But you know what I really wish? I wish we had some young guys around that I could begin to work with and who could maybe have some of their enthusiasm begin to affect me. Iron sharpens iron, and so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. And the truth is that in a balanced ministry, you have old ministers to keep the young guys in the straight and narrow, and you have the young ministers to keep the old guys from getting any older. And maybe from acting as old as they are. I do not know how long we have to finish the work. The end may be a year away, or the end may be 50 years away. If it is longer rather than shorter, I don't think we can afford to finish it out with a tired, worn-out, old ministry. Do you? Those of us who are around now in the ministry, I don't think any of us are likely to be here 50 years from now. And if we are, we will be so old that people will come to consult us like the oracle, and we won't be out doing any work. Somewhere along the line, are there going to be any ministers? If we should happen to be around here 30 or 40 years from now, are there going to be any ministers who have 30 or 40 years of experience in the ministry? The only way that can happen, folks, is if we can find some ministers who are beginning to be about 30 years of age. Like Jesus, Peter, James, John, and so forth. You know, I was so dismayed some time ago when I heard one of the old guys who's in our ministry make the comment, and I don't want to pick on him, but you know, it's just he said it. He said the thing that he said it looks to him like that what we in Tyler want to do is to get rid of the older ministers and bring these younger guys in. And I thought to myself, you know, how in the world can anyone think that way? We don't want to get rid of the older ministers, but we would like to breathe some new life into them. We don't need to be rid of any of the ministers that we've got, but I'll tell you what we do need. We need a Samuel. We need a David. We need a Jeremiah. We need an Ezekiel at the beginning of their ministry, at their early times, who are young and zealous and enthusiastic and idealistic and who make the mistakes of youth and who can breathe some new, fresh life, ideas, idealism into those of us who have been around for a little longer. How in the world are we going to do that? It is a task that, frankly, I look at it and I just take a deep breath and I say, I don't know. I do know one thing, though, that Jesus said to those 30-year-olds that were around him, he said, look at the fields. They're white unto harvest. The harvest is plenteous. The laborers are few. Pray the Lord that He will send workers into His harvest. Will you join us in praying for that? And when He does, will you accept them?